Hello everyone, I'm LevUNknown, the lead developer of the visual novel RPG Mistwinter Bay. Today I'm going to talk about writing and creating the lore of the game, more specifically the creative process behind the game world. So first of all, what is a game world? A game world is of course the physical in-game area where the game takes place, what you can see and experience. But it is also a narrative world. What I mean by that is that everything mentioned in a game that connects to its characters, culture, spiritual beliefs, quests, physical world and so on is part of a narrative that creates a world for the game. An example of this is in Skyrim when you read any sort of book, especially books detailing events that have happened in the past, like the Oblivion Crisis. You usually never see anything of what the books are about in the game, but you can probably imagine that it happened since the game told you it did. So when any character happens to mention anything that you read in a book, you're probably like, oh yeah, I remember that name. Wasn't that the person who did this? And bam, you've been consumed by the narrative game world. With that out of the way, we can get into the details of how I created a narrative and physical game world in Mistwinter Bay. First of all, I started off by setting a scope. How large should a physical world be? The answer is only the town of Mistwinter Bay. That's where you can build buildings and that's where you see the characters actively interact with each other. It's possible to venture outside of Mistwinter Bay during certain events, like when you hang out with foreign leaders. But that only gives you an event background and more of a storybook narrative rather than active dialogue. So you're basically confined to Mistwinter Bay only. With the physical world decided, I moved on to the narrative world. This, unlike the physical world, can basically be infinitely big. It should of course not be so big that it gets too complicated or convoluted. But the thing with narrative world building, especially in games, is that there are so many opportunities to integrate big and small details. Especially small details. In Mistwinter Bay, the monthly events that are the core of the gameplay are randomized, which means that some players won't experience some events. This gives almost endless opportunities to create events that expand on the lore without making it too complicated, since every event is contained to itself. What I mean by that is that you don't have to play a certain event or experience its lore in order to understand what's going on in another event. There are, of course, things and topics that come back several times in events and other parts of the game. These, unlike minor details, should be kept fairly small, and by small I mean related to the game's overall scope. If the game itself is big, core topics can be fairly big, but if the game is small, the core topics should be even smaller. Still, the possibilities for these core topics are practically infinite. It's just a matter of practice to get them not confusing to players. And keep in mind that every large RPG, like Skyrim, Dragon Age, Genshin Impact, World of Warcraft and so on, all make their new players confused with the lore when they start playing. But after a few hours or so, players usually understand the core concepts of the game world and the core topics aren't that confusing anymore. I mentioned the term core topics a few times now, but what do I actually mean when I say that? In Mistwinter Bay, the core topics are cultures and countries, the Empire of Straina, Meblia, Utra, Achate, Flaedal, Iskor and Athal alongside the town of Mistwinter Bay itself, and its religion, avalorism and voidism, and no beliefs at all, magic and alchemy, mythology, folklore and creatures like mermaids. All of these things are large topics that can be divided into smaller portions to make them more palatable. And since they are quite important, there's information about aspects of these topics in the encyclopedia, which is at the player's hands at most times during the game. So when I had created a physical world for the game, I expanded the narrative world by adding the country that Mistwinter Bay is in and the other countries around it. And so the continent of Ruminus was born. The narrative world got expanded even further with continents that a player would never see for themselves, but that still make up the world of Sephra. The world itself got an explanation, a sort of creation story if you will, and Mistwinter Bay got its own history as well. A lot of this can't be actively found by players in the game, but creating a world for a game is similar to creating one for a book. And an author should always know more than the reader. That being said, even I have to go back and look at the encyclopedia sometimes because I've forgotten what I've written. Because this game is very big. The Avalorist and Voidist religions were created alongside the cultures and countries and the stances for magic and alchemy as well. I do still actively expand my own and the game's knowledge about these topics though, so who knows if what is said in the demo holds up in a full game. Oh, and the mythology and creatures that I mentioned as a core topic earlier? Yeah, I may or may not have a long document detailing all sorts of mythology and creatures from the perspective of a famous Stranian professor, who may or may not be related to one of the people who can move into town. We'll see if I release that document in some form at some point if people are interested. Before I wrap this video up, I should probably explain a bit more about the creation process behind the countries and different Romanian cultures. I did say that I would in a previous video, so I better stick to what I said. And thematically interesting, but that's a topic for another video. In hindsight, I've realized that creating the countries is kind of similar to creating a character. They just don't say much, or move, or do anything really. But they all have unique attributes and stances on certain topics, so when I created them, I made a list of things that are relevant to countries. Physical things like climate, resources and typical dishes, but also abstract things like religion, traditions, class system and mode of government. I tried to make every country have a unique mode of government to make each country as unique as possible, since the mode of government is an important and visible thing for any country. I also tried to give each country a unique climate and building style, so that the event backgrounds when you visit those countries would make it very obvious where you were. Speaking of visual aspects of the countries, it's worth mentioning that all countries and regions are inspired by real or fictional cultures. Can you guess which ones? Strana is of course inspired by Western European Middle Ages, and as such, the other cultures are automatically kind of inspired by the same thing, especially Meblia. However, Meblian culture is mostly inspired by Southern European countries like Spain, Italy and also France. Mostly a sort of exaggerated take on French culture that stems from the Renaissance. Utra is hardly surprising, inspired by ancient Norse culture with Vikings and the like. The four elemental countries are not only inspired by cultures, but also a magical element. Ashate is inspired by fire, which automatically leads to thoughts of warm countries, which conjures up a sort of 1001 Nights type of vibe. Iskor is in turn inspired by earth, and its people are literal trees, so a more nature-oriented culture felt natural as inspiration there, and that's why Iskorian culture is loosely inspired by Celtic druids. Ethal is inspired by air, which gives off a light and elegant vibe, and which fictional culture is considered the most elegant of all, probably. That's right, elves. So Ethal isn't really inspired by a real culture or people, but rather a purely fictional one. Last but not least, there's Flaydal, which is a land of ice. At first I was going to make it a country of water, but that didn't make much sense if they're supposed to live on land. But ice, on the other hand, makes sense because you can build things on it. And since it's cold, it doesn't make sense to take inspiration from cultures in warm regions. Then again, I didn't want some stereotypical representation of a cold country where literally everyone is covered in fur, or have them be practically naked either, just because they have adapted to the climate. So instead, I made a compromise. I looked at an existing culture that's historically known for wearing layered clothing, which not only keeps people warm, but also gives off a feeling of elegance. Because as my art teacher at university said, in history, the wealthier someone is, the more fabric their clothes have, and Flaydalans are mostly wealthy. So I took inspiration from Japanese culture and mixed it with protection from the cold, along with the Flaydalan people's bodily adaptation to the cold climate, and thus the Flaydalan culture was born. And all of these cultures are further enhanced by a specific in-game song for each country. The songs are of course inspired by the cultures that inspired the countries. Some songs were easy to create and I made them on first try, but others took longer to get the right vibe. I remade Utra's song like 3 times before I was pleased, but now it's one of my favorites. That will have to do it for now. I've been talking for a while now and I have a game to make, so I must get going. If you think this has been interesting, you can play the game's demo yourself, link is in the description. And if you want to know more about the world of Mistwinter Bay, with spoilers and such things as if the god Averall is actually real or not, you can find a video about that on our Patreon. There are other things on there as well, like in-depth character reveals and sneak peeks, so please consider supporting us there if you can. Also consider liking and subscribing if you want to follow the development of Mistwinter Bay. We'll see you next time.